Mr Deputy Speaker.
Thank the member for Macarthur. And this will be read a second time. And I call the member for Hunter.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Earlier in this earlier in the week in this place, I made a contribution to a biosecurity bill, and I equated on that occasion biosecurity with defence, making the point that it was every bit as important. Why? Because both deal with existential threats, one through potentially attack on our homeland, the other, of course, goes to food security and therefore the ability to sustain ourselves. You can probably mount an argument that education also goes to our very existence, but I won't try to make that argument today. I will simply say that certainly, if not an existential issue, education policy goes very much to what we are as a nation, how wealthy and prosperous we are as a nation, where we sit as a nation in the global community, how much influence we exert. The list goes on and on. Indeed, how happy we are as a nation. And only this morning we read of a report by UK-based economists who are suggesting that in the absence of change, Australia is very much at risk of sliding down the scale of countries in the global community, the rankings, indeed sliding out of the G20, which would be a very, very unfortunate outcome indeed for this country. And of course they equate that largely to where we are heading in terms of our education system. This is Higher Education Deregulation Bill Mark II. Labor opposed the first bill, and I certainly supported that decision, spoke against and voted for that position, and I will be doing, as the Labor Party is doing on University Deregulation Mark II, that is speaking against and voting against the proposition. It's fair to say not much has changed in this bill, Mr Deputy Speaker, save for arguably the $100 million transition fund, but I will return to that. For those listening to the debate who don't watch these things as closely as those of us here and find the debate somewhat complex, it's all pretty simple. The government is now going to allow the universities to charge whatever they like for university courses. There'll be no government control over that, and therefore they will be allowing universities to charge students more money, and of course there'll be no compensation as such as students. We welcome the fact that the government has also backed down on the increase in the rate of interest on HECS loans and debt, but there'll be no compensation as such as students. So the government is taking $2 billion out of the system over the forward estimates, and trying to argue that somehow that is not just a cut, but it represents reform of the system. I don't buy that argument, Mr Deputy Speaker. It is a cut. It's a budget-saving measure wrapped around a concocted budget emergency, as the government calls it. And I heard people on the MPI earlier talking about cost-benefit analysis for things like NBN and other pieces of infrastructure. Well, when measuring the investment or the return on the investment in education, many, many things have to be taken into account. And some of those I, of course, mentioned earlier. Our prosperity, our wealth, our place in the world, etc. I'm going to focus today in this opportunity to make a brief contribution on how it affects rural and regional Australia. And I do note, I was somewhat interested on Bill Mark I that there weren't too many members representing rural and regional Australia on the other side making a contribution. And I think the reason is self-evident, that while they have no choice but to toe the party line on that first bill, that they weren't really supportive of the bill and they weren't prepared to come into this place and defend the bill. I see some of them have added themselves to the list this time around, which I find a little bit bemusing because I've made the point that not much has changed. And I suggest there might have been a bit of influence from the Chief Government Whip and whoever instructs him, Mr Deputy Speaker, but it is nice to see them in here National Party MPs and Liberals representing regional and rural Australia in here, at least attempting to defend what is a very difficult proposition to defend. I saw the members for Lyons and Braddon in particular in here, which is very interesting, given the potential impact of this bill on Tasmania. I just quickly tried to check whether the member for Page has made a contribution. I wasn't able to because the list has been updated. I don't think he made a contribution last time around. I could be wrong. I will check. And I don't know whether he made a contribution this time, but I suspect he did not. I guess he might be running into the chamber in a moment if I've misrepresented him. But certainly his part of the world is one which will be substantially adversely impacted by this bill. To those, again, listening, remember this. Universities can't always just ramp up fees, Mr Deputy Speaker. They can't just ramp up fees to match the cuts being imposed by the government because their students usually simply can't afford it. Now, in universities like the alma mater of the minister sitting at the table, Sydney University and Melbourne University and ANU and the Sandstone universities generally, there you will find as a percentage of their student population about 7 or 8%, 6, 7 or 8% who come from low socioeconomic backgrounds. If you come to my own region, to Newcastle, to Charles Sturt and like regional universities, you'll find that proportion of poor students is around 24%. I think in Southern Cross, which would be of interest to the member for Page, I think it's more like 26%. So you've got to think about the capacity of the universities to recoup these budget cuts by raising fees for their students. Rural and regional students, more typically, simply can't afford it. And I'm tiring of hearing this rhetoric about new scholarships being created to help these students, because the fact is, Mr Deputy Speaker, the scholarships are only coming out of the fee increases. So if the university doesn't increase the fees, the scholarships don't come. And again, rural and regional universities have a limited capacity to increase the fees because their students simply can't afford it. So we end up having a two-tier system, basically. The big city campuses raking in the money as they ramp their fees up considerably, while the rural and regional campuses struggle through the decrease in funding, unable to recoup it through increased fees. And as I said, the scholarships are a misrepresentation of the situation. On that basis, I fear a two-tiered system more generally. I can see the day when our sandstone universities and those close to them, when I say close, I mean close to their status, will be doing all the research, while the rural and regional universities will be teaching only. And that will be a great loss to the economic capacity of this country's great regions. I heard the member for Macarthur quoting, I don't know if it was the Vice-Chancellor, but certainly a senior academic at a Western Australian university. It's a shame that he had to go to Western Australia from Western Sydney to get the quote he was looking for. I didn't hear him quote anyone from the University of Western Sydney. I don't know what their position is, but I can be fairly certain, I think, that they would have grave concerns about this bill, including concerns that the big sandstone universities exercising the scholarship system, they'll have plenty of scholarships because they'll be able to substantially raise their fees. No problem at all. They'll be making decisions about where the scholarships go, and they will be looking around for the best and brightest, whether they be in Hobart, Launceston, Western Sydney, wherever. Plucking, choosing, stealing, if you like, poaching the best and the brightest around the country into their sandstone universities, with obvious implications and consequences for rural and regional universities. I heard a couple of interesting contributions. I heard the member for Lyons say this was going to be a great thing for Tasmanian universities. It was going to create what he called reverse migration. He declared that rather than lose young people, Tasmania was now going to have an influx of young people looking for a cheaper university course in Tasmania, cheaper than they can find in Sydney or Melbourne. I find that a rather extraordinary way of looking at things. Even if it were true, I go back to addressing the issue I raised about the sandstone universities being able to poach the best and the brightest with obvious consequences and implications for others. In any case, who believes really that anyone migrating to Tasmania to do a university degree is likely to stay in Tasmania? If they're from Melbourne or Sydney, obviously the opposite will be the effect. So let's not have any of this folly. The member for Forrest said that her regional students were going to rush to Perth to do their studies and become the best and the brightest, and they were going to come back to Forrest. Well, that's not my experience, Mr Deputy Speaker. So often once you lose them, they never return. But in any case, how does the member for Forrest think that her students are going to be able to afford to pay the big fees in this deregulated system they might expect to pay in the capital city? Not likely, Mr Deputy Speaker. So this is bad legislation. The Labor Party opposes it. I oppose it. We do not want $100,000 degrees in this country. We want a country where equity applies. We want to live in a country where no matter what your background, you have the opportunity to play out your aspirations with an equal opportunity to get the very best education in this country. We do not want sandstone and city universities plucking the best and brightest out of Western Sydney and out of our regions because they can afford to do so, with the obvious impact on our average scores and rural and regional universities. We do not want our rural and regional universities to lose their research capacity, with all the implications that has for local economies and local communities. These are not good things. Now, I said I'd go back to the transition fund. $100 million. It's simply an acknowledgement there's a problem, but doesn't provide the fix. $100 million, while it sounds a lot of money when quickly said, to the ordinary Australian, will go nowhere near what is necessary to compensate regional universities for the loss of that funding. And I seem to recall that the Minister for Education, on the day the government folded the tent on the original bill, suggested he might create a $300 million fund. And the experts saying, well, that would be at least a couple of $100 million short of what would be required to help these regional universities transition to this new deregulated environment. And now, having concluded $500 million was necessary, the Minister is offering a mere $100 million. It will not be enough. And here's the real problem now, and it is of concern to the Labor Party. The clock is ticking for the universities. They have budgets to implement. They have planning to do for the next academic year in 2016. And they simply don't know what their funding environment is going to look like at this stage. We're well into February, and I understand late March is drop-dead time for most of their planning. And here we are in the House dealing with Bill Mark II, and when it gets through this place, of course, it's off to the Senate. And no doubt, absolutely justifiably, it'll be off to a Senate committee, and all the time that takes. So I don't see any prospect of this bill getting anywhere far well before that drop-dead date for the universities. And there's only one group of people in this place responsible for that, and that's a government and a minister who has completely botched this process, wrapping up cuts as reform first without consulting with the sector. Then he had to go out and consult, came back, changed a few things, not much unfortunately, but changed a few things, and here we are mid-February. He's still trying to progress this ill-thought-out bill through this place, and yet has to run the gauntlet of the Senate. That's a real problem. It's a real problem for our universities and our students and for Australia's future. So maybe it's time the Minister folded his tent once again and came back to the drawing board and talked to all the interested parties, both in this place and outside this place, to see whether we can't get a resolution to this very serious problem we have before us. So again, I oppose the bill on that basis, and I appeal to the Minister and his Prime Minister and all those in their cabinet to reconsider a bill which I think is going to be a great disadvantage to our country, particularly our regional communities, and is not the bill we want to put us on a track for maintaining our position, our ranking, our status in the global community.
Thank the member